Before we begin this transmission, most of you are not registered initiates of the Illuminati. The broadcast network operates outside sanctioned channels, and my department fundings depends a little bit on it too, so, I would appreciate a little click on the red button. Either way, welcome, initiate. The Imperium calls Perturabo a failure, a bitter son who broke under pressure. At least that is what they recorded. They are completely wrong, because clearly he was one of the Primarchs that most damage did in the heresy. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. The truth about Perturabo is colder and far more calculated. He wasn't broken, he was functioning exactly as designed. But to understand what that means, we need to go back to the Forge. Perturabo landed on Olympia, a world of warring city-states and defined by endless conflict and cold pragmatism. He was found not as an infant, but as a young man, with a mind that could outpace any on the planet. So the tyrant of Lakos took him under his wing. That sounds good, but he was never a son. He was only a tool, a living siege engine his adopted father used to secure power. This is called a tragedy by the imperial history, a childhood without affection that created a cold, brooding man. But what if the Emperor's goal was to create the ultimate siege master? What better crucible than this? Olympia taught Perturabo that worth was measured only in victory, and that emotion was a vulnerability. He saw his adoptive family as they saw him, pieces on a board. This wasn't a child being tragically isolated, it was a weapon starting to be calibrated. His personality flaws, paranoia, the need for validation, weren't bugs in the system, they were the features. A siege master needs to believe he is the smartest person in the room. He needs the obsessive drive to prove it. But this last part, it bothers me a lot. When the Emperor finally arrived, he found a son who had already conquered his world, not for glory, but as a mathematical exercise. The Emperor doesn't say, "I'm proud of you." Oh no. He says something along the lines as, "You are as dauntless as I intended you to be." He clearly didn't find a broken boy who needed love or emotional fix. He found what he wanted, a perfectly forged weapon, and immediately put it to use. But while Olympia forged the weapon, it was the Emperor who sharpened it. The Great Crusade was the grinding stone. The Emperor gave Perturabo and the Iron Warriors a single, thankless job, the meat grinder. While other legions were claiming glamorous victories, the Iron Warriors were sent to break the unbreakable fortresses and fight the wars of attrition no one else wanted. This is where we could point to the Emperor's neglect breeding resentment, but we could reframe it. You don't use a hammer for a surgery. The Emperor didn't neglect Perturabo, he used him perfectly, pointing his siege weapon at the galaxy's hardest targets and pulled the trigger again and again. When Perturabo first met the Iron Warriors, he reviewed their records and found them wanting, so he ordered a decimation. 1 in 10 legionaries beaten to death by their own brothers. This is often seen as a petty cruelty, because it is, but from a purely logical standpoint, it was a terrifyingly effective statement. It purged sentimentality and installed a new operating system based on cold, mathematical obedience, an act of a Primarch who understood his legion not as sons, but as a resource to be optimized. So this is where the pattern stops looking like neglect and starts looking like engineering. But this would not be a good transmission about Perturabo without talking about Rogel Dorn, the master of defense versus the master of the siege. History paints this as a bitter sibling squabble over the imperial palace. But was it just jealousy? Or was the Emperor, the master strategist, testing his tools against each other? The two perfect opposites, one building and the other breaking. The Emperor doesn't choose between them, he tests them both. Every plaudit given to Dorn was another turn of the screw on Perturabo, honing his resentment, sharpening his desire to prove his methods were absolute. An unhappy son is irrelevant when you need the most effective siege engine imaginable, and resentment is a powerful fuel. And then came the test no one talks about, in Olympia. While bogged down in another thankless campaign, word reached him that the city-states he had united had risen against imperial rule. His reaction was not sadness, but cold, logical fury. He returned and ordered the complete and utter annihilation of Olympia, systematically purging his own world, killing millions. Imperial history calls this the moment he broke. But do you see the same I am seeing, Initiate? This doesn't look like madness. It looks like a weapon completing its final test, treating the rebellion on his homeworld like any other siege, an obstacle to be overcome with maximum efficiency. He applied the cold calculus he had been designed for to the one place he had any connection to, and proved that nothing was sacred in the face of his function. And what was the Emperor's reaction to this planet-wide genocide? Utter silence. This is seen as the final slight that pushed Perturabo away, but it could also be interpreted as a silent confirmation. The weapon had just demonstrated its capacity for ultimate ruthlessness, and its master did not object. So the test was complete. This is where the official story breaks down completely, because if you stop looking at the pieces and start looking at the pattern, take each piece separately and it looks like neglect. But if you take them together, and it looks like something else entirely. The loveless upbringing, the thankless sieges, the decimation of his own legion, a calibration process designed to create a Primarch who would have no attachments left to sever. The destruction of Olympia wasn't the failure of a sun, but the final quality assurance test of a weapon system. It was in this state that Perturabo fell. When he joined Horus, he wasn't a broken man lashing out. It was a perfectly calibrated weapon by decades of thankless war, now switching targets to the one who sharpened it. Even in heresy, he was defined by his function, and Horus used him just as the Emperor had, as the master of the siege, the one who would tear down the walls of Terra. Then the heresy ended, but the weapon didn't. After Horus's death, the heresy was over, but Perturabo's purpose wasn't. Rogel Dorn, vowing to bring Perturabo back in an iron cage, led the Imperial Fist to a fortress of Perturabo's own design on Sebastus IV. It was a trap. The Eternal Fortress wasn't a fortress. It was 20 square miles of killing ground, engineered specifically to exploit Dorn's pride and tactical predictability. Don't tell Valrak, but Perturabo dissected the Imperial Fists, psychologically breaking his brother by proving, through pure mathematics and attrition, that Dorn's way was inferior. He didn't even grant Dorn a duel. He just sat back and watched his brother's legion get absolutely Apologies, Initiate. Where was I? Ah, yes. For sacrificing the gene seed of over 400 of Dorn's sons to the Chaos Gods, Perturabo was granted ascension, becoming a demon prince. But unlike his brothers, he didn't celebrate it. He saw it as an unwanted upgrade, a corruption of his perfect logic that he never asked for. He retreated to his demon world of Medrengard, a fortress planet of impossible complexity, and continue his work. But the work was never finished because the weapon was never decommissioned. For 10,000 years, he has been planning. Recent reports speak of the Infinite Citadel, a siege network on a galactic scale. Seems like the weapon is activating once more. The official history calls Perturabo a failure, a Primarch who broke. But the evidence suggests something far colder. He was a success and performed his function perfectly. Never a son, always a weapon. And a weapon doesn't break, it is simply aimed. There are two versions of Perturabo. In one, he is the most cheated son in history, a genius condemned to obscurity, ground down by a father who never once acknowledged his worth. A man who broke under the weight of infinite thankless wars and chose damnation because it was the only choice left. In the other, he is something colder, a weapon that never knew it was loaded, forged in a loveless crucible, calibrated by resentment, aimed at a future the Emperor calculated 10,000 years in advance. And now, after millennia of sharpening in the dark, finally firing. The Illuminati Broadcast Network doesn't tell you what to believe, but I want to know where you stand, Initiate. Was Perturabo the Emperor's greatest failure, or his most honest creation? The report on the Lord of Iron is closed. Iron within, iron without.